So today I want to talk about a topic that has been kind of one of my central interests as a researcher of communication and also digital technology. And I also want to talk about this because of a series of really interesting conversations that I had with a friend of mine who is also from the publica community, Treasa O'Brien, who is not here today, but I will show a bit of her work as well when I talk, because we had a series of conversations about stories, and I got to thinking about the power of stories, and so that's what I would like to talk about today, and to think about how we can maybe use that power to reconnect Europe, which is, after all, the theme of Republic of Dublin this year. So we know that people have told stories since the beginning of time, and different stories gain different levels of attention. We know that some stories go into history books, and those history books have many, many editions. And other stories get lost in the archives, and some other stories are never heard at all, and they're only told once, maybe by somebody's grandmother. But it is, after all, true that any history is actually a collection of stories, and the only problem is whose stories make it into the official histories. And we know that stories are powerful because they help people connect, often connect across borders. And when we tell stories, we can find similarities between our families, between our cultures. And so what I'm really interested in seeing is, what role does digital technology and digital networks, social media websites, but also any kind of other device, play in helping or hindering this diffusion of ideas through personal storytelling, and how we can maybe change the status quo if technology isn't really helping us do that. We know that even though there's a lot of hype about the power of technology, and that technology permeates every kind of atom of life today, that really it's not just technology that shapes our communication, but it's what we do with technology, right? And as Dizzy Papakarisi, who is a researcher that researches effective storytelling and effective publics, as she says, it is our stories that connect us and not so much the platforms that we use to share them. So yes, having structures, having infrastructures, having networks that are underpinned by technical means is important, but it's also important what we share in those networks. And so our stories are equally important. And we know that, especially in societies which have seen conflict or protest or any other kind of turbulence, it's especially important that people have access to means of telling their stories, their personal stories, sharing their grievances, sharing their problems, sharing their memories, because it is a key means of sharing empathy and promoting conflict resolution and constructive debate. And we can look at any of the countries, be it Ireland or Greece or the Balkan countries or Turkey or Ukraine. Probably every country has seen its fair share of strife, and there are stories that are told. If you've never been to Dublin, I encourage you to go to some of the local museums, and such as the Little Museum in Dublin, or some of the other museums that commemorate the uprising, and listen to the stories told there. If you go to Ukraine, which has in the past 4 years seen a revolution, a protest that turned into a revolution, and it has now turned into a simmering conflict, there's also a fair share of stories. But it's really important, again, to distinguish between the official stories that are okayed by the government or by the official historians and that make it into kids' textbooks, and the stories that people have been telling during the protest, during conflict, and after it. And just to give you a few examples of how public storytelling and digital technology can reshape the way we understand history, I'm just going to give you a few examples. One of them is, to me, and I think we've lost the Wi-Fi, but I'll see that. So to me, I'm really interested in urban space, public space, and how it's used for making sense of the events that happen in cities. And one of the ways in which people use public space in cities is to house public art. But when we think about how people consume that art, so we have an artist who painted something on a wall of a building, a mural, and then how people consume that art is not now just by looking at it, but also by taking a photo and by sharing it on social media and by adding some of their own observations or memories or thoughts connected with that particular photo and that mural and what it stands for. So murals are expressions of moments and records of particular events or thoughts or emotions, but they are also more than that, because they become not just one person's story, but a multiplicity of stories. And how do we tell those stories? How do we share those stories? Just to give you an example, I was captivated by a parallel example of two murals, one in Dublin here and one in Kiev, Ukraine. And I'm going to show you the one in Dublin first. So this is a mural that went up around the time of the marriage equality referendum in 2015. And this is a mural of two men hugging by Joe Caslin. And when it came up, the artist was asked, what is the meaning of this? And he said, it's an effort to spark conversation about the role and treatment of young men in contemporary Irish society. People are asking, what is it doing here? What does it signify? That is the whole idea behind the project. So his whole point was not to make a statement, but to ask a question and to get other people asking questions and then to share their own reflections from what they saw. Here's another example. You will probably see how similar the actual image is. This is a mural in one of the residential districts in Kiev, Ukraine, and this is one of the dozens of murals that came up on these really boring city walls after the Euromaidan protest, when the whole nation, but Kiev as its heart, as it's the capital city, was reconsidering and rethinking what it meant to be a nation, what it meant to be a post-protest country, and also what it meant to have to reflect on very heavy stuff, but also very, very sort of profound stuff, things like hope and love, war and peace. So this is particularly an image that speaks to the conflict in the east of Ukraine, where many people have lost their lives. And so it's really important here to think about what artists mean, what story the mural is telling that the artist meant to tell, but also what people make of the art and the stories that they tell about this art on their Instagram profiles, Facebook pages, Twitter feeds. So what we're having to contend with digital technology underpinning all of these personal stories being told, whether through murals or through something else, is we are seeing that there's an intertwining set of narratives around each event or series of events, and there is a really diverse fabric of cultural, political, and social stories, because to different people this might mean different things. And these can be stories about our cities, about our countries, about ourselves and our own lives, or the lives of others. So to me, digital technology adds this really interesting layer. It augments our storytelling powers in very interesting ways. And so I had this kind of reflection when I was looking at murals, because I was doing a big project on looking at the power of public art and how it's mediated by technology. And then I got to talking with Treasa, who said, actually, I've been dealing with stories as well, but in a slightly different way. Treasa spent an extended period of time during the past few years making a big documentary about Ireland and about the austerity period in Ireland and about people's thoughts on what that meant, what it meant to be a country going through austerity, and also what it meant to be a country that maybe somebody expects people to protest, and yet people kind of don't really protest, or very few people do it. And so she was really interested in looking at what are the stories behind this? What are the stories behind this Ireland that maybe not everybody knows? So what she basically did is she made this really interesting documentary that is called Eat Your Children, and it's about the austerity period in Ireland. And it's also about Ireland's national identity, but also it's really about the people, because most of the footage in the film is people's stories. It's stories of people going through particular hardships, or people leaving Ireland, or people coming back to Ireland. And so I'm going to play you a small 2-minute trailer of the film, just so you get an idea of another way that storytelling can work to create this multiple universe of stories about the same country from very different people. And if we could also turn the sound, because we're going to have sound in this video. So basically you can see that these are really different stories. There are people who protest, there are people who have no idea how to start a protest, there are people who have gone through austerity and are now unhappy about it, and there are other people who have left Ireland entirely. So we have, as one of the protagonists says, there's a big story being spun, and that story is a lie. And that takes us back to this idea of whose history, whose story is in the history books, right? And how do we make sure that other stories also make it and are also on record. And by the way, this film is actually screening this weekend in the Wicklow Arts Festival. It's screening on Sunday, 10th September at 1 p.m. in the Bray Mermaids Arts Centre. So if you want to see the whole film and also maybe have a conversation with Treasa, you're all welcome. It's not very far from here. But to go back to the power of stories, right? So whether it is in documentary making, but even more so when we get into the networked digital sphere in the digital media world, we see that grassroots level storytelling is a key mechanism of connecting individuals, right? And this is where we get more meaning and more shades of meaning from events that take place, because we can now see these events through the eyes of so many different people, and we can almost attempt to kind of find the truth of the matter for ourselves by looking at all the different angles from all the different people. Because obviously no one single person is going to be able to tell us the whole story. But the whole story, as we know now, consists of multiple narratives. But the question arises is, okay, so maybe in theory, social media and digital technology might enable these horizontal networks and maybe allow for a broader distribution of personal stories. But what about access? Does everybody have equal access to audiences? Does everybody have equal access to technology, to broadband internet? Of course not. And so the question is, how do we tackle that problem? How do we identify the people whose voices should be heard but aren't? How do we identify where those people are, what they're saying, and how do we give them and their voices more power? Is it as simple as just getting them the right technology, or are we also talking about, getting them also skills, where maybe teaching them how to use a camera, and so they can go and make videos about their lives and their views and their stories and share them online? Or is it not as simple as that at all, and we have to start with, are these people safe when they tell their stories, and do we have to start with worrying about their safety, and are they allowed to tell their stories in places where maybe their lives are in danger? And as we get into these really complicated issues such as austerity, such as pervasive corruption, such as refugees and the refugee crisis, such as issues of free expression and human rights, which are sadly, even across the European Union, are still very much issues, right, in many, many countries. How do we make sure that people are able to share their stories, right? So we know that digital social media do potentially give people the power to twine those multiple narratives into stories and make meaning about what happened. And that if people do have equal access and they do have the skills, then that means more distributed agency. But what about the ownership of social media platforms, right? That is also a question. Who gets the power to decide which narratives are acceptable and which aren't? So there's a very complex web of things here that it's not just about technology, and it's not just about regulation, and it's not just about giving people mobile phones, but thinking about this as an issue of power, right? Network storytelling has power, but there must also be other things in place for it to become powerful and for that power to be equally distributed. But it is important to think, I think, and obviously my favorite thing to do is always to leave people with questions, and so that's what I will do. I think it's worth meditating on this. If we know that personal stories have power, and that power can potentially be amplified by social media, but also potentially stifled, how do we make it so that these stories influence our shared experiences and our solidarity and our capacity for empathy? And then how, as people who are here to attempt to reconnect Europe, how do we encourage this proliferation of stories in creative ways? And how do we maybe attempt to create a meta-narrative of Europe that is obviously multiple and that is obviously diverse, but is there one? Where do we look for it? How do we create it? And do we build it on existing platforms, or do we co-opt them, or do we build new ones? Thank you.
Well, thanks ever so much there, Tanya. Just stay there a second. Has anybody got any questions at all for Tanya? Yes, excuse me. Just your name, please.
Thanks, Simone. Thank you so much. That was once again super inspiring. I rather have another question. I mean, in Germany we do have elections in 1 month, and one rhetorical trick of the very way right-wing parties are to say, okay, we do actually want to request who's made it into the news, into the history book, which is actually a very important question, but at the same time I have the feeling that right now it's exactly one of those arguments populism are facing quite a lot and addressing, to say, okay, we do want to do an alternative, which is actually the name of the party in Germany, which is running right now for the election, and they are doing quite good because people are feeling the same thing. So another question would be, do you have experience, or do you have some thoughts to share how you can actually still address that very important question without bringing even a further argument or a further topic to those who are now trying to see the world in black and white?
Well, I think that's the issue, is that people who want to see the world in black and white and who also want others to do so, they're all in favor of having an official narrative. And very obviously the official narrative is very often false or half true. And that, I think, doesn't really matter if it's a right wing or, you know, if it's a nationalist or if it's some other kind of government. I mean, the Russian government, obviously, for instance, isn't really nationalist or far right, and yet the official narrative of the kind of history that has led up to the Russia that it is now is, of course, not all-encompassing. It doesn't encompass all the things that happen, and it actually actively erases things that happen that don't fit into the official narrative. So I think, for me, you know, fighting the black and white people is really continuing to insist that it's actually shades of gray and also many other colors, and that, you know, you don't only, there aren't specific people who get to decide what is actual history and what is not, and obviously that shouldn't be based on the color of their skin or their ancestry, that all people are equally able to decide how they shape the history and how they shape the country that they live in. Because I think also, incredibly, it's really, we are beginning to realize that we are living history. Maybe it's because so much of our life is now documented, but I can go back 1 year, 2, 3, 7, and Facebook will show me, look, this is what happened a year ago. Look, this is how much better your hair was 5 years ago. And, you know, it's really, I think, a unique experience because we haven't had this before. We only had, you know, the funny baby photos that our parents made, and mostly they were black and white or maybe color. But this is new to us, and I think people are still grappling with what is the value of this, that there's so much that is being documented and that we have such rich experiences of even small events. And when it comes to big events, whether they're terrible or wonderful, I think there is so much more to each event now that it's getting harder and harder to police the official narrative because people find out about other angles and they find out about other shades. So hopefully it's going to be even more harder to police, and hopefully it's going to be now all that remains is just to figure out how our human brains can deal with so many different angles of looking at the same story.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes. Okay. Just say your name to the microphone.
Hi, I'm Eugenia.
Hi, Eugenia.
Thanks very much, Tanya. That was very interesting. I just wanted to ask you about a dimension that I know that you're researching on, but you haven't brought to the discussion today. But I think it's important to highlight this. This is talking about stories. There's and digital platforms. There's the assumption of some kind of like these platforms presenting a level playing field with, like, you know, everybody having not only access to them, but their stories being distributed in a similar manner. Whereas we know that algorithms, in fact, structure the environment in very specific ways, prioritizing some parts and not others. And what we are increasingly finding is that some very clever people can actually game these algorithms and prioritize a particular kind of narrative. So that might be something that, well, I would like to hear your position on this.
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that there's not nearly as much transparency from companies, because obviously for them it's much easier to pretend to be the level playing field that you mentioned, because then most people who don't maybe understand how algorithms work or don't have time to figure them out will just think of them, oh, but this is Facebook, everybody's the same and equal. But of course that's not true, because these platforms are not just created to house people's stories, they're also created to make money. Or, you know, and then they make money in a variety of different ways. So they make money from using our data and selling it to advertisers, but they also make money from, say, selling political ads. And that's when the manipulation very often becomes more visible, when, you know, we see that a political force can shape the story they're trying to push to its voters in many different ways, depending on what particular groups of voters are interested in. And so then, of course, what we see is it's a number of stories about the same political party. None of them are true. Oh, some of them, they're all equally slightly false or slightly skewed. But people are falling for them because they resonate with what we are interested in. And I think here transparency really and accountability are key, because there's been a slowly kind of simmering, but I think becoming increasingly more loud group of voices among academics, among journalists, among computer scientists, saying that actually algorithms should be just as accountable as your finances if you filed for an IPO, because algorithms are as important as where your money comes from. We need to know how your algorithms and your platform make decisions about which content gets seen more and which content gets seen less. And we also need to see when your algorithms change. We need to know what changed. And I think this is a battle that's ongoing. I do think it will probably get easier. And maybe if a few more horrible incidents happen where we will catch platforms lying, or where we will catch particular political forces actually paying for spreading false messages, that might push the kind of the industry towards policing themselves. But I do agree that it's sort of regulation, not just of algorithms, but also of things like hate speech, of things like abuse, is a huge issue, because it's not just like it's some idealized space in which everybody can share their stories and not worry about it, but it is very much part of the, as we like to call it, the meat space, where there are issues of xenophobia, where there are issues of hate, and all of this is very much reflected in the digital networks. So it's not like they're a separate space. They are governed by the same laws and by the same issues that we face in everyday life.
Thanks ever so much, Tanya. Well, we're nearly out of time. I just wanted to just go over a couple of things. I love the way you said that there were like 3 different levels of stories. That really hit home. The victor always gets the best story. There are the family stories, and then there are the societal accepted stories. Because the government or the people in charge may have one story, and then everybody else who's actually there will have their story. But one thing I did want to challenge you on a little bit was the 2 men hugging. Mm-hmm. Because unless you knew the story behind it, that to some people could be quite alarmist and provoking. Because, if it was the talk that was coming up in 2015 was, should we allow it to happen? And then this gigantic picture of 2 men cuddling one another in Dublin could be quite in your face. Unless somebody knew what it was about, they're not saying we want it to happen, we're not saying we don't want it to happen. There's like...
Well, I think what the artist really wanted was to people first to ask the question of why is it there?
Yeah.
And then for the conversations to start. And to be fair, they also put up a picture of 2 women hugging in Galway slightly later. So the gender equality aspect is there.
Good.
But I think it's really the power of public art, first of all, is I think it's not so much in telling its own story, but it's in provoking conversations, and it's in provoking people to share their own stories. And I've seen this, I've been captivated by looking at what people post when they post a photo of a particular mural anywhere, in Kiev, in Dublin, in Thessaloniki. It's really interesting how it inspires people to reflect on things that very often have to do directly with what's in the mural, and very often they just go off on a tangent. So I think it is provocative, but not in a bad way. It's provocative in that it provokes you to think.
It's not meant to be in a bad way.
Yeah.
It's not meant to be.
Nope. But,
It's down to the viewer, though, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It really is down to the viewer. Well, thank you so much for giving us something to chew on this afternoon. Sort of a swift kick to the people that were sitting in the chairs. Thank you so much for joining us today on stage 2 at Republica Dublin, or RP Dub. That is the end of our final session, and thank you very much for coming.